Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Utah territory. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1870, when the settlements west of Cedar City were little more than scattered shacks, wind-beaten missions, and the faint promise of civilization creeping into a harsh land. Travelers through the territory described long silences that pressed on the mind. No birds, only the distant moan of wind scraping against salt rock. It was in such silence that Sister Magdalene, a woman of rigid devotion and unyielding faith, arrived to re-establish a small convent abandoned years earlier after the frontier violence that followed what records later described in relation to the Mountain Meadows massacre. Local journals from the Iron County Recorder's Office describe a mission of quiet reform, a place where 3 remaining sisters intended to offer shelter to orphans and the dying. Their building was nothing more than a stone rectory beside a shallow well, dug by soldiers decades before. Townsfolk called it the Hollow. The water there was said to taste of iron and carry a strange, mineral scent, though no one could say why. The convent ledger, one of the few surviving documents before the eventual fire of 1884, recorded their arrival. March 9, 1870. Sister Magdalene, Sister Agnes, Sister Ruth. Cold wind, snow fallen. One child found ill on the road, accepted for care. The handwriting wavers, as if written by a trembling hand. Neighbors, mostly ranchers and miners, kept their distance. They prayed too quiet, one man, Elias Brinker, wrote years later. You could pass that place at dusk and feel the cold of it in your teeth. His letter, preserved in a box O, of county ephemera, describes how the sisters rarely came into town except for salt and candles. By early summer, however, whispers began to drift down from travelers that the women were burying something by the well at night. A clerk named Walter Penn took note in his 1871 journal. They say the nuns have graves with no markers, yet the bells ring at dawn. The entry ends abruptly, the ink smudged. No follow-up was found in his remaining pages. When the first snow came that winter, the well froze solid, and so did conversation about it. Yet a few surviving correspondences mention a 4th figure seen near the convent, a tall woman in mourning black, her face veiled, carrying a lantern. She never spoke, and the locals assumed she was one of the sisters. But her name never appeared in any record, baptismal or otherwise. By the spring of 1871, the convent stood nearly invisible behind high sagebrush and the dust storms that rolled in from the flats. The trail leading to it was half erased, and even the stage drivers avoided passing close. Still, occasional visitors, prospectors, trappers, or the occasional surveyor, would mention a faint ringing at twilight, like church bells muffled beneath the ground. In later investigations compiled by Deputy Marshal Corwin in 1878, several locals testified that strangers went up there and never came back. One of them, a drover named Langley Pike, swore that he'd seen lanterns moving by the old well long after midnight. They wasn't looking for water, he said. They was laying someone down in it. His words were dismissed as drinker's gossip at the time. It was Sister Magdalene's letters, recovered decades later from a parish storehouse in Parowan, that revealed the first fractures in their pious order. In one, dated August 3, 1871, she wrote, "Our numbers are lessened. The soil near the well is soft again. I have not slept for days. I hear them singing below." Historians would later compare this phrasing to the writings of surviving witnesses from the Mountain Meadows massacre, noting how trauma from that event had seeped into the religious psyche of the region, a desperate need for penance, even isolation. By the end of that year, the local paper, the Deseret Western, printed a short item on its back page. Reports of sickness among the Sisters of Mercy near the southern ridge. Supplies requested. One found delirious. Physician refused travel. That physician, Dr. Allen Reed, did leave behind a single affidavit dated December 12, 1871. In it, he described arriving too late. The convent, he wrote, was still and cold, the candles burnt low, and the well mouth bound with wood. He claimed to have found only 2 of the sisters, both pale and unresponsive. Their bodies were placed in the chapel, while the third, Sister Agnes, was absent but thought to have gone north. But not everyone agreed with Reed's account. The constable, Jeb Whitlock, later testified that there were 4 graves, shallow and newly turned, behind the rectory. No markers, just small wooden crosses left blank. He stated, "It looked like they'd been buried in haste, maybe all at once." Whitlock ordered the graves left untouched until a magistrate could arrive. But by the time he returned a week later, the entire plot had been disturbed, dug open and refilled. The crosses were gone. Only the frost remained. When the thaw came in early 1872, a traveling photographer, Charles Went, stopped in the area to document the mining camps. His surviving glass plates, found much later in a Salt Lake City attic, include one faint image labeled Mission Well, South Ridge. The frame shows a small chapel, its roof sagging, and what appears to be a covered pit in the foreground. Many believe this was the last known image of the site before it vanished from official record. Newspapers made only passing mention. An April 1872 issue of the Cedar Valley Gazette referred to the abandoned Sisters' Hall, stating that a foul odor persists near the old water pit, perhaps from animal decay. That article, printed beside livestock prices and mine announcements, went largely unnoticed. It wasn't until 2 decades later, during a county boundary survey in 1890, that laborers unearthed what became known as the Nuns' Pit of Bones. One of the crewmen, Thomas Nally, gave a sworn statement. "We thought it cattle bones, but the skulls were small, some with cloth still clinging, the sort worn by womenfolk. A rosary was found tangled among them. The discovery set off brief alarm through the region. Some called for a full excavation. Others wanted the site reburied. Church officials from nearby settlements advised silence, fearing scandal. The sheriff at the time, E.B. Cotter, described the find as a burial site of uncertain purpose, consecrated or otherwise, and had the pit sealed with lime and stone. When historians reviewed these accounts in the early 20th century, they noted eerie parallels to testimonies preserved from the Mountain Meadows massacre records. Again, not for direct relation, but for what they called the lingering dread of sanctified violence. The language of secrecy, of buried sin and silence, echoed through both. A surviving field note from a surveyor named John Ferris D., dated September 1890, reads, "When the wind moves through that valley, it sounds like low chanting. Men refuse to camp there. I do not blame them." By that time, most of the locals who remembered the original convent were gone. The few remaining recalled the strange bell sounds, the tall veiled woman, and the unease that crept into every conversation about that ridge. One farmer, near the end of his life, told a reporter in 1905, "The land remembers. You don't dig too deep there, or it'll start remembering out loud." No official record lists who ordered the site fenced off in 1906, but a county ledger lists a payment for timber and nails, South Ridge perimeter. Since then, travelers have described a depression in the ground, overgrown, silent, and avoided even by the grazing cattle. In 1908, a schoolteacher named Clara Hensley, recently widowed and new to the territory, began documenting the stories surrounding the ridge. Her journals, now preserved in the Utah Historical Society archives, offer one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the site before it was erased from maps. She wrote that the locals called it the hollow that hums. On March the 2nd of that year, she described leading a group of her students on a geography walk near the area. The children, curious but uneasy, pointed out small fragments of bone scattered along the frost line. Hensley assumed they were animal remains until she noticed a tiny rosary bead embedded in one. She took it home, noting in her journal, "The bead bears an engraving of St. Catherine. It feels warmer to the touch than it should." At that time, the region's religious leadership was deeply wary of anything that might echo the wounds of the Mountain Meadows massacre. That tragedy had become a generational shadow, a word spoken carefully, always paired with phrases like, God's mysterious will. When Hensley tried to bring her findings to a local priest, Father Moran, he reportedly told her, "Some faiths are built on the graves of others. Let the earth keep what it hides." Later that spring, she began receiving unsigned letters left under her door, each written in fine cursive and sealed with wax. The first read simply, "You have been seen digging." The second, "The bones are not alone." Hensley's entries grow increasingly anxious after that. One night, she described hearing the faint ringing of a bell, though no chapel had stood there for decades. On June 14th, she returned to the site, accompanied by a ranch hand, Levi Cross, who reluctantly agreed to help her excavate a small portion near the original well. His later testimony to county officials was brief. "We found what looked like a handprint in the clay, small like a child's, pressed into the inside wall of the pit. But there were no prints leading to or from it." The sheriff ordered them to stop immediately. Hensley lost her teaching position soon after, officially for health concerns, though her letters suggest she was forced to leave. By autumn she had moved east to Colorado, where she reportedly continued writing about her findings but never published them. Her final journal entry, written in faded ink, ends abruptly. "If faith is a light, then this land remembers its shadows." The ridge would soon vanish again under layers of time and silence. A drought in 1911 revealed the pit once more. Its covering stones shifted, as if something beneath had moved. Locals reburied it, not out of reverence, but fear. By 1912, the land records listed the ridge as uninhabited, unfit for agriculture, though a few itinerant miners still wandered through, searching for silver veins that never quite existed. One of them, a drifter named Byron Clay, filed a claim for St. Ruth's Hollow, a name he said he found carved faintly into a beam by the old convent site. His letter to the county clerk mentioned voices like singing underfoot whenever he hammered stakes into the ground. The claim was never approved, and Clay disappeared the following winter. A year later, rancher Ephraim Toole came across what he called a shallow sinkhole where the grass won't grow. He tried filling it with soil, but each spring the depression returned, wider and deeper. He later told a visiting journalist from the Western Advocate, "It's as if the ground's breathing." That article, published in May 1913, also noted faint remnants of brickwork and one iron crucifix still embedded in the soil, weathered beyond recognition. By this point, the story of the sisters had already entered folklore. Children whispered of ghostly women tending invisible graves, while their elders refused to correct them. The name "The Nuns' Pit of Bones" appeared for the first time in a serialized pamphlet printed by an itinerant preacher named Amos Griggs, who claimed the site was cursed by divine punishment. His version was sensational, full of trembling handwriting and hellfire rhetoric, but it ensured the story would survive. It was around this same period that a small team of amateur historians from Salt Lake City, led by Professor Edwin Holt, visited the area. Holt had a fascination with what he called the spiritual geography of the frontier, how faith, violence, and isolation intertwined. In his field notes, he referenced earlier accounts of the Mountain Meadows Massacre to illustrate how communities sometimes buried too their shame beside their saints. His assistant, Lydia Marsh, took detailed notes on soil composition and remnants of old timbers near the pit. She wrote, "There are stones shaped too deliberately for accident, forming a ring, perhaps to mark burial. Within, the air feels colder, and silence carries a weight." Holt intended to return the following year with excavation tools, but in February 1914, a sudden landslide during heavy rains destroyed much of the Ridge Road. No further visits were recorded. By 1915, most of the towns nearby were in decline, their churches boarded up, their wells dry. The convent ruins were said to be visible only from certain angles of light, vanishing when approached. A prospector named Merrill Dunn, whose diary was found decades later, described the site succinctly. "The land breathes guilt." The county sealed the area officially in 1916, fencing it off under the title Abandoned Ecclesiastical Property. Since then, No living witness has claimed to enter the hollow and return unchanged. In the autumn of 1916, the last documented official to visit the ridge was Deputy Land Surveyor James O'Rourke. His task was routine, to verify the boundary lines after the fencing of the abandoned ecclesiastical property. Yet his surviving notes, found among estate papers decades later, read more like a confession than a survey. October 9th, 1916. Air dry, wind high. Sound of distant bells, though none in vicinity. Found traces of fence collapsed east side. Soil oddly soft, despite no rain. O'Rourke's assistant, a young draftsman named Peter Lang, reported that the deputy refused to step closer to the pit after discovering a partial shoe and remnants of cloth beneath the collapsed fence. Lang's own statement to county records clerk Sarah Mortimer described O'Rourke as a man shaken by something he couldn't name. Within weeks of returning, the deputy resigned his post and left the territory. His replacement, a bureaucrat from Ogden, signed the closure paperwork without inspection. By 1918, only fading reports and half-remembered rumors kept the story alive. A drought struck that year, the worst in decades, cracking the earth and exposing parts of the old well lining once more. Ranchers noticed their cattle avoiding the ridge entirely, forming tight clusters at night as if frightened. One farmer, Gideon Parr, wrote a letter to the Deseret Evening News that same summer. "There's something unright about that ground. No man can drive a stake without hitting bone or prayer." The letter was never printed, but the draft was found in his effects when he died in 1920. Locals buried him on the northern slope, facing away from the hollow. Historians reviewing O'Rourke's papers decades later drew subtle parallels between his language and accounts from survivors of the Mountain Meadows massacre. The tone, guilt mixed with reverence, suggested a regional tendency to treat tragedy as sacred rather than shameful. The idea that certain grounds were not to be disturbed became a kind of superstition carried in silence from generation to generation. There's an unsigned note appended to one of O'Rourke's last field logs, likely written in another hand. "It isn't the bones that trouble the land. It's the prayers they never finished." By the turn of the decade, the ridge was effectively forgotten. Maps labeled the area as restricted pasture land, and all previous records of the convent property were transferred to a locked archive in Iron County. Even the fence posts rotted away, leaving only depressions in the dirt and a whispering wind that some swore carried faint chanting when the sun fell low. After the turn of the century, the ridge faded from official consciousness, but not from private memory. By 1921, descendants of the early settlers still spoke of the Nuns' well in cautious tones, referring to it as the quiet wound. Some said their grandparents had attended small masses there long before the disappearances. Others denied any such history existed at all. What everyone agreed on was that animals refused to graze within 100 yards of the hollow. A traveling journalist, Martin Devereaux, passed through that year while gathering stories for a serialized publication on forgotten frontier settlements. His manuscript, Shadows of the Desert Faith, was never formally released, but the drafts reveal a striking detail. He described camping near the ridge and waking at dawn to find neat rows of pebbles placed around his tent in a ring. "No tracks, no sign of hands," he wrote, "as if the earth had arranged them to keep me out." Devereaux's notes also mentioned faint voices at night, rhythmic but indistinct, like Latin hymns carried by wind. He returned to town unsettled and questioned locals about the convent ruins. Most refused to speak, except for an elderly woman named Clara Webb, who claimed to have known one of the sisters in her youth. "They came from St. Louis," she told him. "They wanted to make peace with something they'd seen or done years before. That's why they dug the well deeper. It wasn't for water." When Devereaux compared her story to church correspondence archives, he found that several religious orders had indeed sent small missionary groups westward during the late 1860s, many of whom vanished without formal record. Among them was one entry labeled the Southern Reconciliation Mission. Its last correspondence simply read, "May the Lord forgive what must be buried." This resonated eerily with Devereaux's later findings. He traveled to Cedar City, where he found mention of the site in an 1870s parish ledger. 3 sisters received into service, 1 unrecorded, under vow of silence. That anonymous figure matched the local folklore of the veiled woman seen near the convent decades earlier. In a reflective note, Devereux wrote, "This land breeds a peculiar silence, much like the shadow of the Mountain Meadows field, where mercy and madness blurred into one. People here do not forget. They simply refuse to name." He left Utah shortly after and was last known to have settled in Nevada. His field case on the ridge ended mid-sentence. If prayer leaves an echo, this one never stopped. When his belongings were recovered years later, the rosary he'd taken from the site was found blackened, as though scorched from within. By 1923, talk of the ridge had fallen to the level of local folklore, an unspoken warning whispered to travelers who camped too far south of Cedar City. The county's new survey maps labeled the area simply "private claim, undeveloped." No owner's name was attached, though property tax was quietly paid each year by a P. Lang, presumed to be the same draftsman who once assisted Deputy O'Rourke. It was as if someone wanted the land kept on record, but untouched. That spring, a pair of railroad workers, Frank Dalton and Ezra Cole, claimed to have seen faint lamplight in the direction of the ridge while repairing tracks at night. Thinking it squatters, they followed the glow until it vanished behind a hill. Cole later testified in a local tavern that when they reached the spot, they found stones stacked waist-high around a hollow, like a grave pit, and the faint sound of dripping water below. Dalton said he smelled something like wet linen and candle smoke. Both men refused to return after sunrise. A short article appeared weeks later in the Iron County Journal. Ridge near Old Convent stirs new gossip. Night lights reported by laborers. Sheriff advises calm and reminds citizens that ground is private and sacred. The editor, Samuel Harlan, later admitted he printed the story reluctantly after receiving 3 anonymous letters insisting it be told. Each was signed only "for the sisters." Around that same time, a group of university historians, conducting an independent study on Western religious settlements, revisited the Mountain Meadows Massacre archives. One of them, Professor Henry Blakemore, mentioned the ridge obliquely in his notes. Echoes of sanctified silence still ripple through southern Utah. Convents, wells, graves. The need for redemption makes strange monuments of the desert. Blakemore's field sketches showed a crude map marking the hollow's loch. Annotated with a question, "Remains of atonement?" When his team attempted to locate it, they found only scrubland. Locals claimed floods had changed the terrain, erasing old paths. One farmer reportedly told them, "You can walk all day out there and still never find it, unless it wants you to." The university quietly dropped its research, citing insufficient historical basis. Still, Blakemore privately wrote that the case reminded him of the trauma patterns left behind after the Mountain Meadows killings, how faith and guilt intertwined so tightly they became part of the soil itself. By late autumn, the ridge was again deserted. Coyotes howled at dusk, but never entered the hollow. On moonless nights, travelers swore they could see a pale figure standing beside a low mound, holding what looked like a lantern that gave off no light. No one ever approached close enough to know for certain. In 1924, a drought gripped the Utah Territory once more, drying the creeks and revealing patches of long-buried wood near the ridge. A ranch foreman named Caleb Norton, while searching for water, stumbled upon what he described as a sunken doorway covered with ash and roots. He and his 2 laborers pried open the wooden slab and uncovered a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The air was foul, heavy with the smell of rot and rusted iron. They descended only a few steps before the first beam collapsed, forcing them to retreat. Norton later recounted his brief glimpse inside. There were benches, like pews, and something hanging from the rafters, ropes or vines, I couldn't tell. I heard dripping, steady as a clock. He reported the discovery to the sheriff's office in Parowan. The officials arrived 2 days later, but claimed to find no such entrance, only a shallow depression and some broken boards. Yet within weeks, Norton's ranch hands quit. saying they heard singing coming from the ridge at dusk. The event faded from record until 1927, when a fire at the Iron County Courthouse destroyed several archives, including property deeds for the area. Among the ashes, clerks found a partially burned folder labeled St. Mercy Claim, Sister's Record. The visible line beneath read, "To remain undisturbed by order of the Church, per agreement dated 1872. That single surviving phrase reignited local whispers. Town elders remembered faintly that the convent had once received visiting clergy from the south, possibly connected to the same circuits that passed through the region after the Mountain Meadows tragedy. The idea of a sealed agreement fueled speculation that the church had known more than it admitted. Meanwhile, journal entries from a young schoolteacher named Ruth Tolland, who boarded near the edge of the territory, reveal a renewed unease among the residents. She wrote in March 1928, "At night the bells toll again. No church left to ring them, yet the sound carries as if under the earth." She went on to note that the ground around the ridge appeared freshly disturbed after heavy rain, though no one had gone there for years. When she asked about it in town, the general storekeeper replied, "Best not to stir the sisters. They remember too much." That spring, Ruth wrote one last entry. "The air tastes of iron, and I dream of a woman at the well, asking me to bring light." She was found missing from her lodgings 3 weeks later. Her belongings, including the journal, were discovered neatly arranged beside the road leading toward the ridge. No search was conducted. Locals called it the Hollow's Dew. By the decade's end, the hollow was once again sealed by silence, the kind of silence that carries the weight of both faith and fear. The 1930s brought slow change to the region. New roads, telegraph poles, and the arrival of survey engineers documenting the last uncharted stretches of southern Utah. Among them was a quiet civil draftsman named Arthur Delane, whose notebooks, discovered long after his death, hold one of the final first-hand accounts of the Nuns' Pit of Bones. In his field journal dated April 12, 1931, Delane noted, "South Ridge Site, strange depression marked by stones, air very still, no insects, soil smells metallic." He described an attempt to measure the hollow's diameter, but found his compass needle spinning. Convinced of magnetic interference, he marked the page with a simple sketch: a circular pit bordered by wooden posts, one leaning inward as though pulled. Delane's accompanying letter to his wife tells of a sleepless night spent in his tent near the ridge. Around midnight, he claimed to hear distant humming, like women praying in Latin. When he ventured outside, the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a single hollow note that seemed to come from the ground itself. The next morning, he found his measuring chain missing, later discovered coiled neatly beside the pit. He returned twice more in the following months, documenting shifts in the soil after each rainstorm. In August 1931, he wrote, "Uneven ground again. Surface collapsed slightly on east side. Smell of candle wax persists. Locals refuse to speak. One old man said, 'You're walking where mercy failed.'" His later entries show increasing fatigue and fixation, repeating the phrase, "The prayers still echo." Then, abruptly, the writing stops mid-sentence. The last page bears a smear of dark soil across the margin, and nothing further. When state engineers reviewed his notes years later, they found his references to the Mountain Meadows field marginal but telling. He compared the atmosphere of the ridge to a place that holds its own silence hostage, suggesting that the same moral unease that haunted that massacre still lingered in the land. In 1932, a maintenance crew found Delane's abandoned tent and notebooks, but no sign of him. His tools remained neatly arranged, his boots lined beside the entrance. A single rosary bead lay in the dirt, half buried and blackened. Locals once again began avoiding the ridge entirely. The few who rode near it said their horses grew restless, refusing to face the hollow. Travelers reported seeing dim shapes moving among the sagebrush, slow, deliberate, as though in procession. The county officially struck the ridge from its maps in 1934, merging it with adjacent property and declaring it unfit for occupation or record. But stories persisted, whispered from one generation to the next, that sometimes in the stillness before dawn, The faint toll of a bell could still be heard beneath the wind. By 1935, the ridge had acquired a reputation that even passing trappers avoided. The Great Depression had driven many to wander the desert for work, yet not one homesteader ever staked a claim there. When asked why, they answered simply, "The ground prays too loud." That year, a government relief project surveying mineral deposits sent a young geologist, Dr. Helen Carver, to the southern Utah canyons. Educated at Stanford and skeptical of local superstition, she wrote in her correspondence that she intended to dispel foolish folklore about haunted wells. But what she recorded in her field diary tells a quieter, darker story. June 4, 1935. Found depression described by locals. Resembles collapsed well. Diameter approx. 10 feet. Air within cavity oddly cold. Instruments react irregularly. No clear readings. 2 days later, she added, unearthed fragments of wood and cloth at lower rim. Stitching fine, not industrial, possibly part of garment. Markings faintly resemble religious embroidery. Her notes continued for several pages, growing increasingly disordered. She described dreams of women standing in rows, veils motionless despite no wind. She began referring to the hollow as the well of prayers. By mid-July, Dr. Carver wrote that she had uncovered what seemed to be the top of a narrow stone stair descending deeper. She planned to return with better lighting. That was her last entry. Her assistant, a prospector named Hugh Tanner, later testified to state authorities that she had vanished overnight from their camp. The following morning, he found her lantern at the edge of the pit, still burning. The case drew minor newspaper attention. The Deseret Tribune, August 1935, carried a brief column. Lady scientist lost in desert. Evidence suggests fall or disappearance near restricted land known locally as the Sisters Hollow. Search discontinued after a storm. But the truth, according to Tanner's later deposition, was stranger. He insisted that during the search he heard faint ringing below the ground, like small bells far away. He refused to stay another night. When state officials sealed the area weeks later, they filled the hollow with gravel and lime, hammering a wooden cross into place. The location was never reopened. Historians reviewing Carver's diary decades afterward found margin notes comparing the ridge to sanctified massacre grounds elsewhere in Utah's early frontier, again drawing a muted echo of the Mountain Meadows massacre. Her writing suggested that some places retain prayer like a scar, holding on to faith long after life departs. By winter, the wind had erased all sign of the fill. Locals said that at dusk one could still see a flicker where her lantern fell, a glow with no flame, pulsing faintly beneath the earth. By 1936, state authorities had effectively quarantined the area, citing unstable ground and possible contamination. Few questioned the decision. The Depression years made curiosity a luxury. Yet among private collectors and regional historians, whispers of the Nuns' pit of bones resurfaced once more, spurred by Dr. Carver's disappearance and the strange consistency of prior accounts. One such historian, Professor Raymond Lyle, wrote a confidential paper titled Echoes of Faith in Desert Soil, circulated privately among colleagues at the University of Utah. In it, he compared testimonies from Iron County residents with earlier religious settlements and drew subtle lines connecting the story of the lost convent to the deep moral wounds left behind after the Mountain Meadows massacre. Lyle wrote, "The Utah desert seems to preserve not just the bones of the dead, but the intentions of the living. Where prayer and guilt overlap, the earth keeps its own confession." His paper was quietly suppressed by the department for being unsubstantiated and emotionally speculative. Yet Lyle continued his research independently, traveling to the ridge in autumn 1936. He kept only one field notebook from that trip, recovered later from his niece's attic. His first entry reads, "Site reached at dusk, wind calm, smell faintly metallic, notice slight depression in center, covered by gravel and thin vegetation. Heard no sound, but air feels, listening." The next day, he noted discovering a half-buried iron crucifix, corroded and bent at the stem. Likely remnant of the sealing effort, he wrote. Locals avoid even mentioning it, as though to speak might summon memory. He camped 2 nights beside the site, writing that the stillness felt almost reverent, but wrong, like kneeling in an empty church where someone has been buried beneath the altar. On his final night he wrote of hearing faint murmuring, a feminine cadence, rising and falling with the wind. The last page of his notebook bears a single sentence. It isn't haunted, it's waiting. Lyle returned safely but fell ill within a month, dying of a fever that baffled physicians. His notes were sealed by his family for decades, regarded as a private madness. When later examined, the pages were found to have faint reddish stains across the margins, identified not as blood, but oxidized soil. By 1937, the ridge had once again fallen from public knowledge. The last mention appears in a county report referring to the site merely as closed ground. The fencing was torn down that year by unknown hands. No one rebuilt it. Travelers still spoke of feeling watched when passing near the place. And on rare still nights, shepherds claimed that the wind through the sagebrush carried the rhythm of a slow, distant hymn, one that faded whenever anyone tried to listen too closely. By 1938, the land surrounding the ridge was being surveyed once again, this time for the expansion of a small railway spur that would never be completed. A government foreman, Thomas Grady, led the crew responsible for cutting through the lower slopes. His field ledger, later discovered in a regional archive, documents the moment when old ground met new steel. September 19, 1938. Crew struck subsurface void near mile marker 12. Collapse approximately 10 feet across. Interior lined with stonework, primitive mortar. He noted that his men refused to continue digging after a foul smell rose from the fissure. Grady himself descended a few feet and described what he saw in terse clinical terms. Partial wooden beam structure below, possibly old chapel foundation. Several human remains visible, decayed and compressed. Objects include rosary fragments, candle stubs, rusted cross. He halted the excavation and telegraphed for state supervision. The next morning a dust storm swept the ridge, filling the pit with debris before inspectors arrived. By the time the team returned, the hollow had vanished beneath silt and broken brush. Grady's crew refused further work, claiming they heard voices in the wind while covering the site. One man quit that same day, saying, "They was praying for us to stop." The official report buried the event under the label geological instability, but local rumor revived the old name, the Nuns' Pit of Bones. Once again the story circulated, passed from saloon corners to campfires, each retelling blurred fact and myth, yet the pattern remained: silence, discovery, disappearance. A few surviving correspondences from a county clerk named Ada Marin suggest that the diocese sent a representative quietly to bless the site shortly afterward. The visitor's name was recorded only as Father R. Marin wrote in a private letter, "He prayed for hours, though the ground was already gone. Said something about atonement unfinished." By the following year, 1939, the ridge was struck by a small wildfire, lightning most likely. When it passed, nothing remained but scorched stones and the faint outline of a foundation wall. The ground hardened, cracked, and barren. The area became locally known as the Burnt Convent Field. Curiously, the event coincided with a series of letters exchanged among regional historians re-examining the role of religious settlements after the Mountain Meadows Massacre. One passage, written by an academic named Dr. Silas Crane, reads, "Where repentance was planted too deep, the soil refuses rebirth. The Sisters' Hollow seems such a place, a well dug not for water, but to contain what men dare not name." By decade's end, even that study was forgotten. The ridge, once marked by prayer and ash, became nothing more than a contour on a fading map. When the 1940s arrived, the old trails leading toward the ridge were erased by time and erosion. Few living souls even remembered where the Nuns' Pit of Bones once lay. Yet for a brief moment, the hollow returned to public consciousness. not through rumor, but through a chance photograph. In 1941, a photographer named Edward Langford, documenting abandoned mining structures for a federal archive project, captured a peculiar image near the southern plateau. The photograph, labeled simply Old Mission Steps, shows a cracked stone stair descending into the earth, half covered by sand and brush. At the top corner of the frame stands a weathered wooden cross, almost lost in shadow. Langford never realized the significance of his find. The plate remained unexamined until decades later, when archivists noticed that faintly visible along one of the stones were carved initials, SAR, possibly Sister Agnes Ruth. Those initials reignited brief academic interest. A local historian, Margaret Thorne, wrote a short paper titled Forgotten Orders of the Utah Frontier. She noted the uncanny repetition of patterns across the region: small missionary groups, isolation, silence, and then disappearance. She referenced the Mountain Meadows massacre once again as a scar still visible beneath the surface of faith. Thorne wrote, "The western desert holds confession in its dust. Some prayed to be forgiven, others to be forgotten. Perhaps the hollow was both." Her paper reached only a small circulation before vanishing from journals due to the onset of World War II. But for a short time, the ridge lived again in whispers. A traveling veteran passing through Iron County in 1943 claimed to have visited the area after hearing miners speak of old nun bones. In a letter to his sister, he described standing over a barren stretch of ground that seemed to pulse with warmth even at dusk. "It's dead land," he wrote, "but it feels awake." Locals told him that during quiet nights, a low metallic hum could still be heard, like bells rung underwater. Some thought it wind passing through collapsed tunnels. Others refused explanation entirely, crossing themselves before speaking of it. By the end of the decade, the government reclaimed much of the surrounding territory for wartime training. Dynamite testing flattened parts of the southern slope, scattering stone remnants across the flats. Yet the ridge itself remained untouched. Soldiers stationed nearby reported compass failures and sudden gusts that died as quickly as they came. One corporal recorded in his journal, "The desert sings when you're alone, especially near the hollow." When the war ended and the land was released, no one returned to rebuild the trail. The hollow had finally achieved what the sisters seemed to have wanted all along: to vanish, leaving behind only rumor, ash, and the sound of unseen bells that sometimes echo beneath the sand. In the quiet years following the war, few mentioned the ridge by name, but for archivists and amateur historians, fragments began to resurface: letters, sketches, half-burned parish records, and that haunting photograph labeled Old Mission Steps. The more they examined, the clearer the shape of the story became: 3 sisters, 1 silent woman, and a well that refused to stay sealed. Among the few who dared revisit the area was Reverend Paul Wainwright, a retired minister from Cedar City, who claimed in a 1947 interview with the Utah Heritage Review that he had prayed once at the convent site as a boy. He said, "There was no evil there, only sorrow that never slept." Wainwright believed the sisters had been victims of disease or drought, not malice, but he also confessed that his father, a circuit preacher, warned him never to step near that ridge again. Wainwright's brief recollection inspired a graduate student named Eleanor Fitch to investigate the oral histories of Iron County. Her dissertation, never published, contained interviews with aging locals who still remembered tales from their grandparents. One, Mrs. Lucinda Parr, recalled that her great-uncle had hauled lumber to the convent in 1870 and heard the women singing like they were trying to bury something with their hymns. Eleanor's notes also included a strange entry from her field log. Ground at former site unusually warm to the touch despite frost. Found fragment of candle and corroded iron nail shaped like a cross. She compared the site's geography with early maps of the Mountain Meadows region, remarking that both shared similar terrain: valleys enclosed by ridges, isolated and prone to wind echo. In her analysis, Fitch wrote, "The landscape of southern Utah reflects its history, sacred and wounded at once. The legend of the Sisters' Hollow may not describe a haunting, but a haunting memory of faith collapsing under its own silence. When she attempted to revisit the site in 1949, locals refused to guide her. One elderly rancher warned, "You'll hear the bells before you find it, and by then it's too late to turn around." That spring, heavy rains flooded the valley, and whatever remained of the hollow was buried under layers of silt and stone once more. Fitch abandoned her research, leaving her final note unfinished. The land has learned to hide its prayers. The ridge disappeared from public record again. Only scattered mentions survived. A diary here, a faded map there, a broken crucifix traded among collectors. Yet through all of them ran the same refrain, that the silence of that place wasn't empty. It was listening, and sometimes it whispered back. In the early 1950s, Utah's deserts drew the attention of new kinds of visitors: surveyors, archaeologists, and road crews sent by the Bureau of Land Management. Among their scattered reports is a curious internal memorandum dated August 17, 1952, referencing a collapsed mission site south of Cedar Valley. The file, unsigned, described irregular subsidence patterns and residual traces of lime and charred timber. One margin note reads simply, "Possible burial site, ecclesiastical origin." The brief investigation was halted within a week, officially due to budget cuts. Unofficially, several crew members refused to return after claiming to hear metallic ringing in the ground when their trucks idled nearby. The ridge was quietly marked inaccessible on survey maps from then onward. But curiosity persisted in smaller circles. A local librarian, Martha Gleason, began compiling all references to what she called the Lost Convent of Iron County. Her handwritten index cards, later discovered in the Cedar City Library basement, reveal years of quiet obsession. She cross-referenced early parish ledgers, old witness testimonies, and even Delane's 1930s field journal. In her margin notes, she wrote, "Every 50 or so years, the ground gives up a sign, bones, bells, or blood." Gleason's research included comparisons to known tragedies in the region's past. She cited the Mountain Meadows Massacre as a psychological mirror, both events born of faith, isolation, and guilt buried under silence. She wrote, "Perhaps these lands absorb repentance, perhaps they simply reflect it back." Her final recorded note in 1954 describes a strange personal encounter. After visiting the outskirts of the ridge with a local rancher, she claimed to have heard the faint sound of women's voices carried on the wind, not singing, but reciting, as though repeating something forgotten. The rancher insisted it was only the air whistling through fence wire, but she wasn't convinced. Weeks later, Gleason mailed a sealed envelope to the county archive labeled, "Do not open until 2000. Inside, archivists later found a short typewritten page. "The sister's well still breathes. The prayers were never answered. If anyone should find this, remember, silence was their penance, and the ground keeps it still." She died in 1955, and with her passing, the legend faded once again, resting beneath new roads and dust. Only the rare wanderer, who camped too close to the Old South Ridge, spoke of hearing faint bells at midnight, or glimpsing soft light flickering beneath the sand. And though no one could ever locate the hollow precisely again, it was said that compasses still faltered somewhere between the flats and the foothills, as if even the earth refused to point true in that direction. By the late 1950s, Utah's South Ridge had become nothing more than a forgotten coordinate, a pale blur on aging maps. Yet even in absence, the Nuns' pit of bones continued to echo faintly through those who studied the early frontier's haunted faith. Among them was Dr. Samuel Horn, a historian at Brigham Young University who specialized in Western missionary archives. In 1957, Horn published a limited circulation essay titled "Unspoken Altars of the Utah Frontier." He never mentioned the hollow by name, but described a vanished mission site south of Iron County, where devotion became indistinguishable from burial. He drew on fragments of court records, letters from the 1870s convent, and excerpts from testimonies following the Mountain Meadows massacre. His tone was measured, almost clinical, yet it carried an unease that few academic works dared express. "We do not inherit their sins," he wrote, "but we stand upon their graves. The silence of those who prayed here remains a kind of echo, audible only when the land itself is listening." Horne's research went largely unnoticed until his death 2 years later, when his personal papers revealed correspondence with several Iron County locals who warned him not to stir old soil. One letter, unsigned, read, "The prayers have not stopped. They only need ears." After his death in 1959, an assistant cataloging his effects discovered a sealed envelope marked "Private Ridge Notes." Inside were 4 faded photographs, close shots of broken stones, a wooden beam with carved initials, S.A., and what appears to be a shallow depression filled with dark silt. On the back of one photo, Horne had written in pencil, "Same coordinates, ground shifted, but still hollow." No one ever verified his location. The negatives vanished from university archives soon after. Through the next decade, the ridge fell once more into obscurity. A widening highway bypassed it entirely, and the surrounding land was leased for grazing. Ranchers reported little, except that their animals avoided a small patch where the grass never grew. A few mentioned that on still nights they could hear faint chimes carried on the wind, like a church bell muffled beneath miles of earth. By then, the legend had shed all names and dates, becoming something quieter, deeper, a warning without words. And for those who happened upon the story in scattered journals or the hushed recollections of elders, it no longer sounded like mere folklore. It felt instead like the land's memory, patient, enduring, and unwilling to let go. Today, the exact coordinates of the Nuns' pit of bones are lost, absorbed by time, sand, and silence. Maps have changed, roads have cut through the old ridge, and the desert has reclaimed what men and faith once disturbed. Yet even now, locals from the outer counties still speak of a place where compasses spin, cattle wander wide, and the air tastes faintly of iron. When late summer winds move across the flats, some travelers say they hear it, a single bell tolling deep beneath the ground. Others insist it's just the echo of wind through distant canyons, or the shifting of stone under heat. But those who've stood there, the few who claim to have felt the air go still, tell of something stranger. The silence thickens, the light dims, and for just a breath they swear they hear voices, women's voices, low and unbroken, murmuring a prayer that sounds like sorrow itself. A field investigator named Marion Coyle, visiting in 1961 while researching Utah's lost missions, left behind a simple note before leaving the state. No ghosts here, just faith that never found peace. In her letters to the Historical Society, she reflected briefly on the tragedy, paraphrasing older scholars who had written of the Mountain Meadows massacre. When the land is asked to hold too much grief, it learns to whisper. Every stone becomes a witness. Coyle's words closed the final known document mentioning the ridge. After that, it vanished once again. No articles, no expeditions, no records. Perhaps it was finally left to rest. Or perhaps it waits still, beneath the same sky, beneath layers of dust and regret, where prayers were buried deeper than the bones themselves. And if one stands there at dusk, where the sagebrush parts and the wind loses its voice, there is said to be a feeling, faint but certain, that the ground remembers. It remembers every hymn, every silence, every desperances, the plea for forgiveness that ever touched it. The land around the old Utah territory carries that memory quietly, like an old confession sealed in stone, unresolved, unforgotten, and eternal.